Today we're going to be talking about seventh chords, their resolutions, and tendency tones. These are very important concepts in the classical and romantic period. So if you understand these concepts, then you're going to do really well going forward in this course. And this is really the first step towards learning how to analyze music. We've talked about the phrase model a little bit, but this is where we really start to hone our skills and learn how to develop the ability to construct that 5/7 to tonic resolution that's so important to all of classical and romantic period music. So the 5/7 chord and its inversions. In the 5/7 chord, you've got two tendency tones. So remember, a tendency tone is anything that wants to resolve one way or the other. Typically, they want to resolve by step, and they're either going to resolve up or down. With the chordal seventh, so if we're in the key of C, you've got your G major chord, that would be the 5th scale degree, so that's your dominant. The dominant has a 7th on the top, so that'd be an F. If you look at this first example here, we've got the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th. The 7th is your first tendency tone, and it wants to resolve down to this E. No matter where it is and no matter what inversion it's in, that F wants to come down to E. Here, the F still wants to come down to E. The F wants to come down to E. It's just a very standard way to resolve that dissonance between the root and the 7th. The chordal 3rd, which is also the 7th scale degree of the key, always wants to resolve up. So the B will come up to the C. This B here in the bass will come up to the C. This B in the soprano will come up to the C. This B in what we could call the alto will come up to a C. It always resolves up. If you can remember that the 7th resolves down and the leading tone resolves up, you're going to be in really good shape. When we voice these as a root position or a first inversion chord in close position, the chordal 3rd and the 7th will resolve inward to a 3rd. So here, this B and this F, they're going to come in. So if I were to play that, there's your 5/7 chord in the key of C. The 7th comes down to E, and the leading tone, or the 3rd of the chord, comes up to C. So what you end up with is this. There's your 5/7 and it resolves to a 1 chord. It sounds like a very solid cadence, right? So that's the goal. And no matter where these chords appear, these chord tones appear, they need to resolve down or up depending on whether you're dealing with the leading tone or the chordal 7th. My cat does not agree. If you look at the next two chords in these two measures, the 7th and the leading tone, so here you've got your 7th, the F, and the B, that creates an augmented 4th. So the augmented 4th wants to resolve outward to a 6, right? It's not that it's resolving different. It's just that it's following its tendency to resolve. So that F still wants to come down and the B still wants to go up. So let's take a look at this. You've got your B here and your F here. The F comes down to an E, the B goes up to a C. That's a 3rd. You've got your F here and your B here. The F still comes down to an E and the B still goes up to a C. That's also a 3rd. If we look at it when it's inverted and the diminished 5th is turned into an augmented 4th, the F will resolve down and the B goes up. So the notes you'll have are E and C. They're still resolving the same way, but it forms a 6th instead of a 3rd. So this is just an important concept that's going to come back a few different times in music, and it's basically that the diminished 5th wants to resolve inward to a 3rd, and the augmented 4th typically wants to resolve outward to a 6th. So try and remember that because it's going to come back in multiple different ways as we continue through these lectures. So some incorrect resolutions. If we don't resolve the chordal 3rd correctly, it results in poor voice leading. So in this first example, we've got the 3rd, the leading tone, here in the tenor and here in the soprano. And notice that it's resolving correctly. The B is going up to a C, and the other B is also going up to a C. So what could be the problem with this progression? The leading tone's resolving correctly. The problem here is that the leading tone has been doubled, and we do not want to double any tendency tones because they're already powerful enough as it is. They already define how the chord is going to progress. So we only want one instance of any tendency tone. So because of that, this also creates parallel octaves. So the B goes up to C, and the other B also goes up to C. Anytime you have two notes of the same pitch class that are moving in the same direction, you have parallel octaves. When they are an octave apart, that would be the same pitch class, right? So let's look at another option. Let's say the B goes up to C here in the tenor, but the B in the soprano skips down a third to the G. That's also a problem, because look what's happening between the soprano and the bass. Here we have a third, that's fine. And then we have a C and a G. So this is moving into what we call a direct or a hidden fifth. So we have two things we need to avoid. We need to avoid those hidden octaves and those hidden fifths. And since the soprano is not moving by step into that G, this would be a problem. It just creates this sense that one of the voices has dropped out because that fifth is so transparent. So we want to avoid this sort of thing here. So you can't double the leading tone, because if you double the leading tone, there's just going to be all kinds of errors, and here's two of the most common errors that might occur. Other errors could occur as well if you failed to include the third of the chord or you made some other mistake. But these are going to be the two most common ones. If you resolve one of the leading tones correctly and don't resolve the other one, you get what happens in measure 2. If you resolve both the leading tones correctly, you get parallel octaves. So it's definitely something to avoid. So measure 1 shows both leading tones resolving in parallel motion, and measure 2 shows an unresolved leading tone, which results in direct motion into that fifth. So remember, direct, hidden motion, they're the same thing, two different terms for the same thing. It simply means you're moving in the same direction, so both voices are either moving up or down. In this case, the soprano's moving down and the bass is also moving down. And it's where you move from any interval into a fifth or an octave. So because this basically forms a compound fifth, the C and the G, that would be a problem that we have to avoid. So both examples are errors. That's very critical for you to understand. All right, so root position resolutions of 5, 7 to 1. And I have multiple construction videos where I go over this really quickly so you can kind of see how to resolve these progressions. So in the first example, we have an incomplete 1 chord. So if you look at this, you've got a C, another C here, there's an E, and then there's another C. So the root of the 1 chord has actually been tripled. And that means we had to leave out the G. But we have to leave out that G because otherwise we get voice leading issues between the 5, 7 and the 1 chord. So this is one possible resolution where the 1 chord is able to be incomplete, but then you get a 5, 7 complete chord. So you get all 4 chord members. So you got a G, you got a B, you got a D, and you have an F. That's all 4 chord members of that G major triad. So this is ideal. If you have either the 5, 7 complete going to a 1 chord that's incomplete, or you can also have a 5, 7 that's incomplete. So that means you leave out the fifth of the 5, 7 chord. So here we have a double G. You've got your third, which is a B. The fifth is missing. That should be a D, either up here or down here. And then you have your F. So we leave out the fifth of the 5, 7 chord in order to have a 1 chord that's complete. So notice the leading tone still goes up, the 7th of the chord still comes down, you maintain the common tone, and then you follow the bass motion, 5, 7 to 1. So this only occurs when you have a 5, 7 to 1 progression, and that's an important concept to know. It doesn't matter if you want to make the 5, 7 complete or the 1 complete. Just remember that if you make the 5, 7 complete, then you'll have to make the 1 chord incomplete, and then you'll have a tripled 1 chord. If you make the 5, 7 chord incomplete, so you're leaving the fifth out of the 5, 7, then you get a complete 1 chord. So why would you choose one over the other? Probably voice leading would be the major reason why. Another reason is maybe you want a really strong 1 chord. Maybe you want to firmly establish that you are in the key of C. So you give us that really strong 1 chord ending. It sounds very final. Maybe you want a stronger pull into the one chord. So in that case, you're going to use a 5/7 because now you've got all four chord tones and you're going to make that 5/7 complete and move into an incomplete one chord. It's a little bit of a weaker ending, but it's a stronger pull into that ending. So there's pros and cons of both options, and I highly recommend you play these on the piano and you listen to both so that you know, if you're composing your own music in a tonal style, which one you want to use in each given situation. So if we look at all this, if you have an incomplete one chord, which is the first measure, you're going to have a tripled root, you're going to have 1/3, so that would be the B, and you're going to omit the 5th, so that would be the D. Notice that there's no common tone here. So this actually creates a very strong, almost a ragged progression, because in the second option, that common tone helps to smooth the voice leading just a little bit. It creates some familiarity between the 5/7 and the one chord. With the first option, there's no familiarity because there's no common tone. So with the second option, you'd want a doubled root. You're going to have 1/3. You're going to have a 7th, and you can omit the 5th of the 5/7 chord. And make sure you retain that common tone to really smooth out that progression. When it comes to resolutions in inversion, they're actually a little bit easier than the root position chords in my opinion, because with any of these inversions, first, second, or third, you're going to have all four chord members present. So here, your G is right here, that's a root. The third is in the bass because the first inversion chord always has a third in the bass. Then you have your 5th up here, and it could be in any voice. And then you have your 7th. So all four chord members are present. And you'll see that for each one of these. Here we have a G, the root. There we have the 3rd. Here we have the 5th and the 7th. In this last one, we've got a G, so the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th. Now, one of the things about this particular chord is you can actually resolve from 5/4/3 to 1, which is more common, or 5/4/3 to 1/6. But you have to be careful going to 1/6 because what will end up happening is if we move this D and then we have a 3rd in the bass, which would be an E, then you end up doubling the 3rd because the 7th still has to come down. So the more common resolution would be 5/4/3 to 1. It wouldn't really be wrong to double the 3rd in this case because it'd be a first inversion triad, and that's okay. But you still would want to avoid that unless there's some particular voice leading effect that you're trying to create. So let's go through this one by one. So here you write in the bass, so you've got the 3rd in the bass, and then it just resolves to the 1 chord. And the next thing that I would do is resolve that leading tone. So in this case, it's already been resolved by the nature of the bass. So the next thing I always look for is the 7th. So the 7th always needs to come down. So our 7th is this F, and it needs to come down to the E. So then you check to see if there's any common tones. And in the inversions, you're always going to have a common tone because you're always going to have the 5th and the root of that chord. So here is your G. That is the root of the 5/6/5 chord. It's also the 5th of the 1 chord. So you just hold that over to create a smooth voice leading and familiarity between the two chords. And then you go through and you check to see if you missed any chord tones. So we have a G, we have a B, we don't have a D yet, but we have an F. So we put this D in the soprano and we resolve it down. So this would be an example of an imperfect authentic cadence because we have this inversion in the bass. And if you want to be really particular, you'd call it a contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadence because it's moving by step. So actually all three of these progressions would be considered contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadences because they all have this one in the soprano, but it's the inversion in the bass that makes them imperfect and that makes them contrapuntal. So if we go into our 5/4/3 chord, we've got a G here, that's your root. We already put in the bass line, so we've got the 5th in the bass and it resolves to 1. So then we've got to put in our 3rd, but I always like to resolve the leading tone and the 7th first. So our leading tone just goes up and our seventh comes down. Same thing here. Here we have the seventh in the bass. So you move from F down to E because F is the seventh of the 5 chord. And then you maintain the common tone so that G holds over. This here, you've got a D, that is not a tendency tone. So we move up and we make sure we put in our leading tone first. So we have a B going up to a C. And then here, we want to make sure we double that root if possible. So the D will come down to a C. So what would happen if you move from a D up to an E? You'd be doubling the third of the chord, and it wouldn't give the same sort of stability that it would have if you had a doubled root. And especially since this is a 1/6 chord, it's going to be a little bit unstable as it is, so we really want to try and double that root. But if you check everything over and you go from D to E, that's not technically wrong, and if there was a voice leading reason to do that, you could. So, basic overview here. All 4 chord members need to be included with inverted resolutions of the dominant 7th chord. So in the 6/5 chord, you got first inversion, leading tone resolves to the tonic, the common tone is repeated in the same voice, and the 7th moves down by step. So now we go on to our 4/3. I'm just giving you a more precise review now. In second inversion, the leading tone resolves, so we see that here. The common tone is maintained, and the 7th moves down by a step. So right here, down to the E. In 4/2, now this one always has to go to 1/6. It's because of the nature of the bass movement and the fact that you have the 7th in the bass and it has to resolve down. So you can't have a 5/4/2 that goes to a 1 chord. That would be an incorrect voicing. So first, we need to make sure the leading tone resolves, and it does. The common tone is still maintained, and then the 7th moves down by step, and that's our bass note, and then we just move from D down to C so we can have that doubled root. So there's a few exceptions to tendency tone rules. So 2 of these exceptions are in measure 1 and measure 2. In measure 1, this is its own exception. It occurs at the cadence. So what happens here, take a moment, pause this video, see if you can see what's wrong with this progression. I'm going to give you 3 seconds and I'm going to tell you the answer. 3, 2, 1. So what's wrong with it is this B is not resolving up to the C. The alto voice is actually skipping down a third to the G. So why is this allowed? This can only occur at a cadence. You don't want to include this in the middle of a phrase. It has to occur at a cadence. But what's happening here is because of the close position of everything, the soprano is moving down to the C, and the B, it sort of sounds like it's resolving to the soprano C. Because they're so close together, we can make an exception, and then the B can come down to the G, and that allows you to have a 5/7 chord and a 1 chord that are complete. Remember, with a 5/7 chord, typically you have to omit the 5th of the 5/7 or the 1. But let's say you wanted a complete 5/7 and a complete 1. That would be a very strong cadence. So you can do this by skipping down in an inner voice. So the alto is typically what you're going to do. And the soprano will come down to the C. So here we have a G. Here we have the B, the D, and the F. So all 4 chord members are present. Again, here we have a C, another C, an E, and a G. All 3 members are present and the root is doubled. You'll notice that the 7th still comes down, leading tone still technically goes up, but it's being masked in an inner voice, the incorrect resolution. And because it's in an inner voice, we don't hear it as clearly, and this makes this resolution okay. So the second one, Soprano-Bass Tenths. What's the error here? Go ahead and take a few minutes. It's one of the tendency tones. They are not resolving correctly. Try and figure out what's going on. Pause the video. I'm going to give you the answer in 1, 2, 3 seconds. All right. So here, the 5/4/3 chord, this is the 7th. It needs to come down to an E, but it doesn't. It goes up to the G. So why is this okay? In this particular instance, you have soprano and bass tenths. So here's the bass, and here's the soprano. Notice the C and the E is approximately a tenth apart. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly a tenth. It can be a multiple of a tenth. It just can't be a third apart. So you may have an E, an F, and a G up here, and the bass may stay the same. We'd still call that soprano-bass tenths, and that's still allowed. But what this allows for is this really strong ascending voice leading. So because of that, we don't really hear an issue with this seventh not resolving, because this ascending motion is so powerful and so strong, it sort of circumvents that issue. So let's go a little more detail into this. If the leading tone is in an inner voice, it's possible to skip down to the closest chord member to arrive at a complete one chord. So in this case, the leading tone of the 5/7 or the key of C, or the third of the 5/7 chord, just depends on how you want to view it, skips down to the G, which is a fifth of the one chord. To the ear, the leading tone still sounds like it's resolving. And for the smoothest voice leading, you want to use a perfect authentic cadence. So here we've got scale degree 2, going down to scale degree 1, so that's moving by step into the tonic in the soprano voice, that's ideal. And then we have scale degree 5 going up to 1, so that's a perfect authentic cadence. It's a perfect example of a PAC. So let's talk about soprano-bass tenths. This is an expansion strategy that's useful to expand the tonic area. But unlike the first measure here, you don't want to use this one at a cadence. This can only be used to expand a tonic area or one of the tonal areas. Typically it's going to be the tonic area. So the 5/4/3 second inversion chord may serve as a passing chord between 1 and 1/6. So you'll notice what happens here is if we maintain the common tone, you come down to the leading tone and resolve it up, and then you just have that F that goes up to a G, you end up with a 5/4/3 chord. So the soprano and bass move in parallel tenths. This contrapuntal motion overrides a problematic resolution of the chordal seventh, so it resolves up instead of down. Two important exceptions used in different instances. Again, this one here, where the leading tone doesn't resolve, but you get two complete chords, is used at a cadence. This one is never used at a cadence. It's used to expand a tonic area. It's just to create more interest. And it's a great method for actually expanding the beginning of a tonic area or the middle to create some variety and use some chords other than just one chords. Whenever you're writing a piece, you just don't want a bunch of one chords in root position in a row, because that becomes harmonically stagnant and it's really boring to listen to. It's going nowhere. But if you move up from C to D and you get that 5/7, and then you come up to a 1/6, now we get some movement in the bass and the soprano, and it's much more interesting. So moving into the perfect fifth and the perfect octave. So we're going to talk more about what a direct or hidden octave is, and I'm going to give you some examples of parallel and contrary motion. So direct octaves and fifths are not allowed in the outer voices, but they are permissible if the movement is in the inner voices. Direct octaves in the soprano can be resolved by moving down by step. So here's a few examples. You notice how you have a C here and a C here, and then we have this really unusual interval here, right? This wouldn't be a normal chord progression, but we have this B sharp moving up to a C natural. That should actually be a B natural. So this B natural moves up to a C natural, and the G moves up to a C. Since they're both moving into an octave, even though this is not an octave, this would be an example of direct octaves. So we have to avoid that. If, on the other hand, the soprano moves by step into the octave, so you see the G moves up to the C here. This actually should have been a G, not a B sharp, so that's a mistake. But if you look at this one, the B moves to the C, and the G moves up to the C. Because the soprano's moving by step, it makes those direct octaves okay. Contrary fifths, This G and D are a compound fifth that then come into a C and a G that are a simple fifth, right? So that contrary fifth motion also needs to be avoided. And a big clue here is that you've got this massive leap in the tenor. Anytime you have something that doesn't move by step, you need to double check that because you probably did something wrong. Unequal fifths. So if we look at the B and the F, this is actually a diminished fifth. The diminished fifth should go inwards to a third, right? But in this case, the diminished fifth is actually going into a fifth. So we'd call that an unequal fifth. You can't move from a diminished fifth to a perfect fifth because then you're not resolving the chord tones properly. If you look at this, the F, which would be the seventh of the chord, resolves up and it should resolve down. So that's a problem. When it is okay is if you reverse it. So here we have a C and a G. That's a perfect fifth. And it comes down into a diminished fifth. This is not parallel fifths because the quality changes from perfect to diminished. And it's also, even though it's a type of unequal fifths, it's an allowed type of unequal fifths because there's no particular resolution that has to happen between a perfect fifth. So between this C and the G. So parallel are when both voices are moving in the same exact direction. So if I have this D going to an E, and then let's say I had another D maybe down here, and it moved up to an E, those two voices would be moving in parallel motion. There's not an example of parallel motion here, but just know that when you're moving in octaves or fifths and you're going in the same direction, those are parallel octaves. Those are parallel fifths. So when you're moving consecutively in fifths or octaves, that's a problem too. Okay, so a few issues that students often encounter in their harmony writing when they're writing for four parts. The first one would be voice crossing. This occurs in the same harmony. So if you look at this chord right here, this G4, because it's in the fourth octave register, actually sounds right here on the second line of the treble clef. So the tenor is actually higher than the alto. That would be an example of voice crossing, and that would be an error. Voice overlapping occurs when you have two different chords. So you'll notice this G here, it's in its own octave register, it's its own register, it's its own space. And then the soprano is also in its own space. But then the G overlaps the C and goes one step higher. So this D is actually overlapping with the C. It's overlapping voices. It's crossing into the soprano's territory. So this would not be allowed. You have to avoid this. If it's a unison, it's not crossing, it's not overlapping, it's actually the same note. This is actually okay, but there's a big red flag. You better check your chord progression carefully because you've got two leaps and you really want to move the shortest possible motion whenever possible.